Anubis had a presence that unnerved everyone he passed. One look was enough to tell you this was no ordinary dog. The vet picked up on it instantly the moment Anubis entered the clinic alongside his owner, David. Without wasting a second, the vet quietly phoned the police. Meanwhile, David waited calmly in the reception area, completely unaware that his visit to the vet was about to spiral into something far more serious. And the police? They were about to make David wish he'd never laid eyes on Anubis. David's instincts screamed at him to grab Anubis and leave. He had no idea why the vet had contacted the authorities, but he couldn't risk losing the dog that had become such a deep part of him. But he was already too late. Before he could reach the exit, officers stepped through the door. David was trapped. He didn't want to surrender Anubis without a fight. But then the police started explaining why they were there, and in an instant, David's entire world shifted. Anubis was unlike any dog he had ever known. How had he missed the signs? But what had triggered the vet to call the police? What could possibly be wrong with his dog? Could David even bear the thought of giving him up? He hadn't gone out that day looking for a dog, but when his eyes met Anubis's, something strange happened. He couldn't look away. The look lasted only a second before the dog, with piercing yellow eyes and sharply pointed ears, turned his gaze back to the pen wall. Despite a ripple of fear crawling through him, David felt compelled to move closer. There was just something about the dog. Two thoughts cemented his decision then and there. First, he'd already decided on the dog's name, Anubis. Second, the man selling the dogs from the corner of the farmer's market clearly didn't care for the animals in his charge. The seller mentioned offhandedly that the black dog had only arrived yesterday. People had taken one look at him and moved on. Said he looked too dangerous. If no one bought him, the seller said the dog would probably end up at animal control. That meant one thing: he'd be put down. David's heart dropped. The man didn't seem particularly invested in finding good homes for these dogs, and David feared he'd ask for a price he couldn't meet. But he didn't. He just wanted to get rid of the strange black dog. David's better judgment told him he should probably talk to Monica, his wife, before bringing home a dog, especially one that looked this intimidating. And with 4-year-old twin boys at home, this was definitely something they should have discussed first. But the seller was packing up. Time was running out. David couldn't bear to think of what would happen to Anubis if he walked away. He didn't ask. He didn't wait. He paid the man, took the leash, and guided Anubis, calm and surprisingly obedient, to his truck. During the entire ride home, the dog didn't make a sound. He simply stared out the window, still and silent. It was only once they pulled into the driveway that David realized he hadn't heard so much as a whine or bark from Anubis. He'd never seen anything like it. Could Anubis have been trained? Maybe a retired police or military dog. Something about him was far from normal. As David stepped onto the porch, he could feel Monica's furious gaze through the window. But before she reached the door, their two boys, Melvin and Marty, burst out in excitement. David braced himself, tightening his grip on the leash. Would Anubis snap? Monica appeared just behind the boys, fear written all over her face. But Anubis didn't move. Calm, quiet, controlled. He was as collected as ever, his fearsome appearance at odds with his behavior. Melvin and Marty were thrilled, jumping and shouting that Anubis was the coolest dog they'd ever seen. As the dog remained perfectly composed, Monica's anger began to soften. But inside, she was livid. How could David make such a huge decision without her? What was he thinking, bringing home a dog that looked like this, without warning, into a home with children? And from a random guy at a farmer's market? Once she'd said her piece, David apologized. Then he told her everything. When Monica heard that Anubis had been one step away from a kill shelter, her frustration began to fade. She looked at the dog again. Strange or not, there was something about him. Against her better judgment, she admitted it, she kind of liked Anubis. Monica's only lingering concern was having a dog like Anubis around their twin boys. The kids were loud, unpredictable, and full of energy. David agreed it would be wise to supervise all their interactions, at least for a while. But what no one expected was that Anubis would end up guarding them from far more than just a few bumps and scrapes. To David and Monica's relief, Anubis adapted shockingly well to family life. He was calm, eerily calm, and nothing seemed to faze him. As a bonus, his menacing appearance served as an effective deterrent. No one in their right mind would dare to approach the house uninvited. And yet, while Monica and David were slightly unsettled by how unbothered he always appeared, Anubis remained perfectly composed, completely unshaken. Walks in the park became awkward. Whether it was David or Monica holding the leash, people veered away as they approached. Dog owners, joggers, even the occasional cyclist. Everyone kept their distance. A month passed. Anubis still hadn't changed. His behavior remained as muted and emotionless as the day they brought him home. David couldn't shake the unease that had begun creeping up on him. It wasn't that Anubis was dangerous, he never acted out, but it was the emptiness in his eyes, the lack of response to anything. He wasn't just calm, he was void. David decided it was time for a proper vet visit. Not just to confirm the basics, but to finally answer a question that had started to gnaw at him. What was Anubis? The appointment was scheduled for 3 days later. In the meantime, David dove into research. He tried to pinpoint a breed, searching for anything that even remotely matched Anubis's unique features. But nothing added up. Every guess fell short. The twins were excited when they heard about the vet visit. They insisted on coming along, convinced their presence would help keep Anubis calm. But David gently declined. If something really was wrong with Anubis, he didn't want the boys anywhere near it. Besides, Anubis had never once shown even a flicker of anxiety. Vet's office or not, David doubted anything would rattle this dog. But he had no idea how terrifying the appointment would become. The clinic was unusually busy that afternoon. Delays had stacked up. Some earlier appointments had gone long, and an emergency had thrown off the schedule even more. David and Anubis waited quietly, while the other pet owners couldn't help but stare. Some people pulled their animals close. Others locked eyes with Anubis and then quickly looked away. David knew the look well by now, fear. Normally, he'd let it roll off his back, but this time it would actually cost him. Sorry for the interruption. Before we continue with the story, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out. Thank you so much. Now back to the story. An employee approached David, a nervous smile on her face. She lowered her voice and awkwardly asked if he wouldn't mind waiting outside. A few of the other clients were feeling unsafe with Anubis in the room. David glanced down at the motionless black dog. He sighed, frustrated. Anubis wouldn't hurt a soul without cause, and David knew it. But the world didn't care. To them, he'd always be a threat. People avoided David's gaze as he stood up. Quietly, with resignation, he led Anubis outside. He didn't know it yet, but what happened next would change everything. They had only been outside for a few minutes when a man in a long coat passed by. He slowed, turned, and froze when he spotted Anubis. He asked David if the dog was his. When David nodded, the man crouched beside Anubis without hesitation. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't the least bit intimidated. He introduced himself as the senior vet, just returning from his break. He was in a rush, but something about Anubis had caught his attention. He wouldn't say exactly what. Then he asked if David would be willing to switch to him for the appointment. He'd make sure they were seen right away. It was strange. The man was almost too eager, but the cold was biting, and David had no clue how long the wait might still be. He agreed. Sure enough, just 10 minutes later, they were called in. The people in the waiting room stared daggers at him for cutting the line. David didn't care. Let them stew in their judgment. The exam room felt more like an operating theater. The senior vet was already inside, suited in full protective gear. It was excessive. As David began explaining his concerns, the vet barely listened. His eyes scanned Anubis, methodically inspecting the dog's body, his eyes, his still posture. Then, without warning, he cut David off, said he had to take care of something quickly. He stepped through a side door and shut it behind him, leaving David and Anubis alone. David could hear muffled voices, a conversation brief but serious. It ended after a couple of minutes, and David waited for the vet to return. But he didn't. 10 minutes passed, then 15. David knocked, called out. Nothing. Finally, frustrated, he tried the handle. Locked. His patience snapped. He pounded on the door, demanding someone come get him. Still nothing. Rage surged through him. With a sudden burst of fury, David kicked the door open. On the other side, the vet stood calmly, unbothered by the shattered frame. David, breathless and alarmed, demanded an explanation. The vet glanced at his watch, then said what David least expected. He had contacted the police. They were on their way. David reeled, stunned. Why? What was this about? But the vet refused to elaborate. Let the police explain, he said. David's thoughts raced. They were going to take Anubis. That had to be it. And David wasn't going to let that happen. Without another word, he turned on his heel and bolted for the second door. Anubis moved with him, silent and swift, but they were too late. David froze as soon as he saw them. Police cruisers lined the front of the building, and among them an animal control van. They weren't just here to talk. They were here for Anubis. One of the officers motioned toward the leash. David immediately stepped in front of Anubis, his body tense, fists clenched. He wasn't going to let them take his dog. Not without a fight. If you want him, David shouted, you'll have to go through me. The officers didn't react with force. One of them, calm and collected, stepped forward slowly, hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. His voice was steady as he began to explain. The senior vet, he said, had identified the dog, confirmed his true identity during the examination. What he found was enough to warrant alerting the authorities. David listened, confused, heart pounding. Anubis, the officer explained, wasn't just any ordinary Mexican hairless dog. In fact, his real name was Zolo, and he belonged to a highly respected religious leader in Mexico City. The man was nationally recognized for promoting the traditions and spiritual beliefs of the ancient Aztecs. The officer continued, in Aztec mythology, dogs of this breed were believed to serve as psychopomps, spiritual guides who led the souls of the dead through the underworld, a sacred responsibility. This particular dog, Zolo, was a symbol of peace and passage. The religious leader would bring him to funerals, where Zolo would sit quietly by his side, his stoic presence offering comfort to grieving families. The message was clear. The gods had not come to collect the soul of the departed. Zolo's calm behavior, his eerie stillness, it wasn't natural. It was trained, purposeful, sacred. But months ago, Zolo had been stolen, taken by anti-religious activists opposed to the leader's influence. For a while, it was believed the dog had been killed. Instead, he'd somehow ended up across the border, abandoned, sold at a farmer's market, eventually found by David. The puzzle finally clicked into place. All of it, the demeanor, the silence, the unnatural calm. David was stunned, and yet, as much as he wanted to deny it, he knew what he had to do. Zolo didn't belong to him, not really. The dog had a purpose far greater than what David could provide. It was one of the hardest things he'd ever done. But David stepped aside, and Zolo, once Anubis, was gently led away. In time, the dog was returned to his rightful home in Mexico. The religious leader, deeply moved by the dog's safe return, offered David a generous reward, thanking him for preserving something far more valuable than money. Life eventually returned to normal. David and his family adopted a new dog, this time with full paperwork and unanimous agreement from every member of the household. Did you enjoy the story? Would you have given Anubis back like David did? Tell us in the comments below. If you liked this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another upload. From time to time, David still thinks about Anubis, about Zolo, about the dog that was more than just a pet. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next video. Have a great day.